Yeah, and I think that that's like, isn't that the Goldilocks question for all
Yeah.
this? It's like, how do you, like, I've never done open source before. This is my one open source project I've ever done.
I'm looking forward to chatting with our current guest, who's sitting right next to me. Not in the same room, but the real question is, who is Joel? Joel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Joel. I'm an engineer at GitHub. I've been working here since 2018. I work on a team called Design Systems. We own really it's a system of systems, like all the tools that people use to build user interfaces at GitHub, whether it's mobile apps or icons or we have a CSS library that you can kind of think of as something like Bootstrap. We have React components, and we also have what are called Vue components, and that's what we'll be talking about today. My main role at the company is to work as the lead maintainer of the ViewComponent framework and basically the corresponding internal work around the project. I invented ViewComponent in late, I guess it was in 2019. Yeah. And I've been working on it ever since in an increasingly full capacity. It is now and has been my full-time job for about a year, but it was like a side project when I first got started on it.
If you want to take over and kind of drive and show us maybe the demos and what it looks like.
Sure, yeah. You can switch to my screen and I can do some demos.
Cool.
So this conversation obviously assumes that if you all are watching, you're somewhat familiar with what Ruby on Rails is. It's a web framework for building web applications, written in Ruby, and it uses what's called the MVC framework. So in Rails applications, you have models that inherit from action view base. You have controllers that inherit from action controller base. But when you're writing templates, they are not inheriting from any Rails construct. They are written as what's typically like an ERB or a slim file. So at a very high level, what ViewComponent is it's a way to express your views using objects, like you would express models as objects and controllers as objects. So if you think about it that way at the highest level, if you're familiar with React, a lot of the work we've done on ViewComponent is a direct inspiration of working in React. So what we've really our philosophy on the project has been, React is doing all these great, cool things, and it's causing some people to want to use React instead of the traditional Rails view stack. So how might we take some of those cool ideas and bring them back into Rails in a way that makes sense for the framework? So ViewComponent is kind of what I would call it's a hypothesis that we can take some of those React-centered ideas and introduce them into Rails applications in a server-side rendered context. So I can give an example of what that looks like. This is the viewcomponent.org website. When you build a view component, it really is two files. So we can look at this example here. I'll make this a little bigger. So a view component is really two files. It's a Ruby file and a traditional template that sits right next to it. So you can do Ruby object things. You can have an initializer. You can include modules. You can do all sorts of things. You can have private methods. All the things you know and love about working in Ruby, you can do in Vue components. And then alongside the Ruby file, you have a template that looks fairly traditional. And then together, what you end up doing with a Vue component is you instantiate it and you pass it to Rails' render method. This is a change that was added to Rails 6.1 that GitHub contributed to the framework. So you instantiate the Ruby object and you pass it into render, and then it returns the rendered output from the template based on the arguments you passed into the Ruby object. That's kind of what a Vue component looks like in a nutshell. It gets much more complex from here, or it can, but that's the gist of it.
It's interesting to hear that the inspiration itself came from the way React sort of decided to do their components. And I think React's component architecture, like basically the idea or the hypothesis for how to leverage components, have kind of spread in other JavaScript frameworks. So it's cool to see this here in the render method, but also super cool to hear that GitHub contributes back to Rails itself too as well, because we do build a lot of our platform on Rails.
Yeah, we have a significant amount of contributions to the framework. It kind of, even just for this feature, I think I probably landed 8 PRs in Rails. It wasn't in the end a lot of lines of code, but it was significant changes that allowed us to do this without doing what's called a monkey patch, where you just like basically go in and rewrite part of Rails like in your own application. That was pretty messy. We do have that monkey patch if you're using like an older version of Rails. So this one really interesting aspect of this framework is that we have implemented it in a very backwards compatible fashion. I think that we are fully compatible or mostly compatible with Rails 5.2, and we're currently on 6.1, which is several significant releases apart at this point.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and Damian Burke mentioned that he didn't appreciate React until he saw view components and what we're trying to do there. So that's pretty cool to hear.
Yeah, it's been really kind of poetic, because like what's been really fun is that because we're trying to take ideas from React and bring them into Rails, we're ending up with that kind of dynamic internally at the company. So like on my team, we build view components that people then reuse throughout the company. That's the Primer View Components library. And we also have a team that builds the React components that you just said you're familiar with from your demos.
Yeah.
But we actually have a lot of collaboration in between the two teams, and like trying to make our APIs like named this, like feel the same way, so that like if you were to drop into our Rails stack, that you would be right at home, even though you're using a different technology.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And folks, it seems like people are really digging this so far. So if anybody has any questions on the approach or how we implement this at GitHub, Joel is here as an engineer at GitHub and is happy to address any questions as well. Which is the one question: why Twitch? Because you're here. That's why we're using Twitch.
I see another comment from Damien about how widely used are view components in the GitHub Rails app. I can speak to that pretty specifically. I'm fine
awesome.
Chatting about that.
Yeah.
So we use view components a lot. Like I get this question a lot, and people are often like, this seems like kind of like bleeding edge. Like, how much are you actually using this? And our adoption is very significant. I can give you an idea. Our application has about 4,800 templates in it. About 40% of those templates render a view component. So a good chunk of our application. I would guess that at this point, you can't really load a page in the application without using a view component in some fashion. We also have, that's in terms of how they're used. In terms of how many view components we have, I think we have about 550 that we've written just inside the GitHub application. We also then have the open source ones, Primer View Components, and I think we're at like 40 or 50 there.
Okay.
So it's a lot.
Yeah. And what was the, I guess here's a question that I have for you, which is the adoption. Like, was it an easy pill to swallow for, and so there's a reason why I asked this question, I'll get to the adoption for engineers at GitHub, because a lot of folks were rendering templates differently. We went through this with GraphQL. Like, a lot of people didn't want to use the data through GraphQL, but also popular opinion from DHH. He's always had very interesting opinions about things like React, but also the future of Ruby on Rails. So like, what was the sort of adoption, and how was it sort of taken from engineers when we started doing this a couple years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a couple interesting aspects of the adoption that I can speak to. One has been that we had an existing abstraction that served a similar role called view models, which are basically the presenter pattern where you have like an object you instantiate and you pass data into it, and then it exposes some methods, but you just pass that one object into a template and it interacts with them. So it's kind of like just the Ruby part of a view component and not the template part. Like, it's just this top bit and not this bit. So for a lot of teams, the path was pretty simple to just like take existing view models and convert them into view components. And the reason that was important for these teams that like really drove adoption was that when you test a view model, you're generally testing the instance methods. So you could imagine if this was a view model, you might have a method that's like def title. So when you would test that view model, you would assert that title is equal to, like my title as a string or something like that. The problem is though, is that doesn't actually make sure that like what you rendered on the page is at all correct. Like what you're showing to users is correct. And typically in Rails, you would do that with like a test where you open up a browser and like look at the page and be like, okay, did it render that text? Since view components output HTML, we write our tests against rendered HTML and not like just a method call. So we say, hey, I can actually just show this in a test here.
Yeah.
Let's go into testing. So this is what a view component test looks like here. Get this a little bigger. So you can see that like we can literally do a render call, this render inline helper we provide in the library or in the framework. And then we can run, you can use the capybara assertions against it. And these are the assertions that you typically would use in like a browser test. But because we have render DOM output, you can just write effectively what looks like almost like a controller test or a request spec without spinning up a browser, without going through the whole like Rails controller stack.
Sounds like we have a guest back. Excellent. Are you coming in live from
live from my iPad, man? Oh my goodness. I have never seen a computer break this badly as it is right now. Nothing is working.
There was one question. Oh, so Damien actually, and he previously was the one that had the revelation about React and using React or using components or basically paying attention to it, which is his question is, how do other view components interact with primer view components? Are they using inheritance, or are you combining them in templates or some sort of component objects?
Yeah. That's a great question. Composition versus inheritance is a classic OO question. So we do composition is like the one sentence answer. But I can maybe provide a little more color about how we think about it, which is that it's really, we think of components as falling into one of two specific approaches. One is components that are specifically related to a domain concept from an application. So for example, in the GitHub application, we have a repository model. So you could imagine we might have like a repository title component or like a repository card component that like shows a little summary of a repository as a card. Those are what we call like domain specific components. None of those are open source. But then we write a second kind of component, which is the primer view components, which are the opposite. They have nothing to do with the domain, but they have to do with a certain design pattern. So one example would be like a blank slate component, which is the component we display when like a page is empty. That has nothing to do with any specific domain, with any specific domain model. So you might have a repository blank slate that wraps the primer blank slate that composes over it. So what we end up having is we have a lot of domain specific components that under the hood use one or more of the primer view components to build up the design.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we do a ton of that. That's basically how we do it. And so whenever we have a generic component that isn't coupled to a specific part of the domain, we put it in primer and open source. So what you see in the primer view components library is all these patterns that we've realized have nothing to do with any specific domain model at GitHub and are really just general purpose.
Okay, awesome. There was a question before that too about Storybook. Can you put view components inside of a Storybook?
You can, yeah. This is Open Source Friday. This is a great Open Source Friday story. Contributor, one of the contributors to the framework, his name is John Palmer. He lives in Boston. I believe he actually contributed the change to Storybook to allow server rendered components, and then wrote a gem you can use with view component to use it with Storybook. So for primer view components, if you go to the primer view components docs, we have Storybook integrated, I believe. You should, when you go to like a component, be able to click like view in Storybook, and it will send you to the Storybook URL.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna check that out too as well, because that's actually a great story as well. You're 100% correct on that. One other thing that came up, actually, we're sort of caught up on questions, but the point where you dropped off was with the MySQL or MySQL and testing view components.
Yeah. So the thing that we could have done this with view models if we wanted to, but what we built is a testing harness around rendering view components that counts the number of queries that have been executed in the request before and after a view component is rendered. And if that number is different, internally we require you to register that in your test to say like, this test makes 3 database queries. And that's not something that we previously had for writing view code. And it's really enabled people to recognize, be forced to recognize that their view code has database side effects, which in the Rails context is generally not a good thing. Like it can be okay sometimes, but it's something you want to be aware of. You don't want to do it without knowing you're doing it. And that tooling is like, as you can imagine, catches things like n+1s. Like if you have a component that you pass 10 things into and you all of a sudden it tells you you have 10 queries, you're like, oh, I have an n+1. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I mean, the questions just keep coming too as well. People are
great.
Is there plans, and I might not know the answer already, but is there plans to merge this in the actual Rails?
I think that there are what I would call intentions.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say there are plans. Our desire for the framework all along has been to figure out what the future of Rails views should look like. I don't know if we're there yet. We're certainly learning a lot through this project, and we've seen a lot of benefits inside the company. The real long-term question is like, is this the right thing for Rails in general, or is it just a good tool to use in certain cases?
Yeah.
Our intention design-wise, though, has been that it will be something that we will keep as close philosophically and like API design-wise with Rails, so that like, say we land on V3 or V4 and we're super happy with it and the community is happy with it, that it will be an easy sell, that it will be like an easy migration into Rails. In its current state, though, I don't think it's ready. The main reason is that when you use view components, it's like a separate folder. Like Rails applications all have a view folder, and this is different. And I think that would be really confusing to new Rails developers. Like you wouldn't want them to come into a project and be like, wait, what do I put in views and what do I put in components? Like, what's the difference? Like, Rails doesn't give you 2 ways of doing models or 2 ways of doing controllers. It gives you 1.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's breaking the convention of the current state of Rails, I guess, which I could find if this would make it to upstream Rails and as part of like what comes with Rails new, it'd have to be a lot of decisions and perhaps have to come. I think Rails 7 is here. It'd have to come as like a Rails 8 thing. Well, this is my thought is probably we'd want to wait until this is a thing and convinced that more than just GitHub or other large companies are going to be able to benefit from this, which is my question. Who else is using the view components at the moment?
I mean, this is honestly the paradox of open source. It's so hard. Like we build this project, we have over 100 people who have contributed to it. The used by on the sidebar says like 500, but that's only open source.
Yeah.
So if you scroll down to the side, like you see, there's over 500 used by, and we have over 100 contributors. So like, I know, and I've spoken to some people privately, like, who's using it. Oh, DFE is probably the coolest one. That's the UK Government Department for Education.
Okay.
They're using it, and they actually have their own like view components library they publish. But I actually, it's tricky because like I know some places that are using it, but like it's been told to me in confidence. Like a lot of companies, they don't talk openly about their tech stack, and I respect that. Like that's their decision. But it's proven pretty popular in the community. I think we're at like almost 2,000. We're going on 2,000 stars now, something like that.
Have you seen any of the design systems or theming providers that are using view components as well?
Yeah, I've heard from a couple people that are doing it. There's one financial services company that is using it. They've built an internal design system and they're using it in like 20 Rails apps or something like that, which is amazing. They're actually reusing their design more than we are at GitHub. Yeah. There's a lot of people doing systems. I think someone started to build a Bootstrap view component implementation, but I don't think they finished it. What I've been hearing from people is that generally people do this as an internal thing, kind of like we basically open sourced our internal view components, but a lot of people are doing kind of what you see in Primer view components. I get a lot of questions. I get almost as many questions about that repo as about the framework, because a lot of people are at that point where they're like, okay, we want to do the same thing you're doing for Primer view components. Like, what have you learned? Like, what would you do differently? That kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating to hear that too as well, because I think it sounds like a lot of folks are trying it out, regardless if they publicly talk about their tech stack and stuff like that. But it's got to feel pretty good though to have an idea, have it get some adoption at the company you work for, and then get adoption at other companies and other developers sort of like leveraging it. My question is like, what was the sort of basically what was the point that it actually started taking off and getting adoption? Did you have to? Yeah, I guess that's my question to you.
Oh gosh, the thing is, it's been such a slow boil.
Yeah.
Like the temperature has been rising slowly since like gosh, I built the prototype in December 2018.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. That's a long time in technology. I mean, it started out as a little prototype. We tried it a couple places. I worked on it with Aaron Patterson Tenderlove, worked at GitHub at the time, and he provided a lot of the like really core like technical underpinning work at the beginning. And then we just kind of it's been a really, honestly, a slow process.
Yeah.
It hasn't been like some like overnight switch. We've attacked it in many different directions. Like some of it was at the start, it was really curiosity driven. It was like, we're doing it. And some people at the company would see we're doing it. They're like, oh, cool. Like this looks fun. I'm going to go use this on my team. And honestly, that was all we could handle for a long time because we were still figuring it out. And we didn't want 20 teams to adopt this pattern if it wasn't good.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, the level of curiosity was well aligned with our level of attention we could give the project. And honestly, that really hasn't changed. It's just that there's been more curiosity and there's more people working on it. Like we now have, depending on how you count it, 4 people working on it full time, plus many other people who are like strongly involved in the project, both in the community and at GitHub that are just like, they make contributions here and there. But it really has been like fairly organic. There was one point where I specifically asked for a team for like last summer, and we went through and we did a bunch of refactors. Like we spent like 2 months doing refactors, but that was maybe the one like truly intentional like migration rollout time we've had.
Yeah, that's pretty cool too as well. And do you think the slow burn, or the slow burn, the sort of slow rise of temperature has anything to do with the maturity of Rails?
Yes.
And the ecosystem?
It's the maturity of Rails. It's also the maturity of GitHub. GitHub is a 14-year-old Rails application. Like we're in it for the long haul. The way we think about maturity has to be different than like a startup that's building something new. We have all this code that is what I like to call revenue code, not legacy code. We have a bunch of revenue code that exists and needs to be maintained, and we need to make engineering decisions in light of that fact. So that, to me, changes the time horizon I operate on. I operate on like a 5-year time horizon when I think about my work. I'm not like, what's the new hot thing we can ship today? Let's like experiment with this thing and get it out tomorrow. Like we need to be much more intentional because everything we do just gets magnified over this gigantic Rails app. Like nothing is small once it becomes mature here. I mean, I think that one of our core engineering philosophies here is that we try to one of the things we optimize for is the ability for people to come into the company and be productive in the application. Like for a long time, we made it the goal that every new engineer made a production deploy in their first week. And to have an engineering organization and architecture that enables that requires you to use, I shouldn't say requires, but like pushes you towards using technologies that are more public than private. So we learned a big lesson with our use of Rails. We were on a Rails fork for a long time. Many people who are watching this are probably familiar with Eileen Ushatel's talk on how we went from a Rails fork to being on Rails main. But having seen that, like I think she gave that talk the spring I gave my RailsConf talk in Minneapolis. I think she gave that, it was the same one. So that is a really important context for why we open source this project very early on, was that we didn't want to end up in a situation where we were developing this project in a vacuum. And I will say that, like, honestly, working with the community, like we've gotten some incredible contributions that like we would have gotten to eventually, but I would guess that we are twice as far progress wise in the framework than we would have been without it being open source. It's been like a really cool, like, I think the term win-win is cliche, but it really has been that kind of situation where like we have benefited from a company by open sourcing it, and the community, I believe, has benefited quite a bit by us doing the same. So it's very mutual.
Yep.
There you go. So you can see that has a little banner. It says this component uses JavaScript. So if we can actually check 2 things off a list at once. There's a storybook link there if you want to view the storybook. So here is our storybook.
Yep.
I haven't really tested this one, but let's go to clipboard copy. Yep. So if you click on that, I don't know if we have the behaviors working here yet. This is still pretty experimental for us.
Yeah, it looks like the behavior is not active yet.
Yeah, it's not active there yet. Never mind. So, but just basically this component, when we use it in It has a sidecar asset.
Okay.
So we use it for that, and then we are currently in the process of building out our practices around doing that internally in our application too. That's for JavaScript.
Yeah.
This is a great segue into contributing to the project. If you go to GitHub/ViewComponent and go to the pull requests, you can see, if you scroll down, there's a CSS encapsulation PR. It's 877, I think.
Is it 677?
677, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It's amazing you have that in your head, but you actually been working on it since March. So yeah.
Yeah. So this is a proposal we're working on. This is actually quite out of date at this point because we've kind of gone back to the drawing board internally. But one of the things we're looking at is, you know how I said we were taking ideas from React and putting them into Rails.
Yeah.
One of those ideas, well, let me take a step back. We purposely started with the ideas in React that were non-controversial, very easily ported into Rails. Like just we're like kind of hitting us over the head that we're so clearly like a good idea.
Yeah.
We've crossed a lot of those off though at this point. So now we're starting to look at some ideas that we're like, I don't know, like maybe this will be a good idea, maybe it isn't. And one of them is CSS and JavaScript. So a lot of React applications today use CSS and JS in some form, whether it's Emotion or any of these other frameworks. So we've started to experiment with trying to solve the same problems in Rails. So the problems are like encapsulation of styles, like CSS is global by default. It's a mess. You can only, those folks watching the stream can probably only imagine the madness that is 14 years of custom CSS having been written at GitHub. Like that's a lot of, it's just a lot of custom CSS. So one of the things my team is responsible for is like really the technical data around that. So this work is looking to see what ideas from the CSS and JavaScript landscape we can bring to Rails through ViewComponents. And the thing that CSS and JS ultimately gets at is that you are writing CSS alongside your component. And because you do that, you can do some programmatic guarantees. You can say, I'm always going to scope these CSS selectors based on like a hashed identifier of the component. Yeah. So you never get global scope for your CSS.
Yeah. It's kind of like I guess a lot of the generated CSS and JS like generates that in your CSS. So folks, if you're familiar with like style components or emotion.
Yeah, that's easy. And that's what we use. The reason we're into it is that that's what we use on the React side. On Primal React, we're using style components.
Okay.
So we're starting to really what we've been doing with this that I think is fun is that like because we're on such a long time horizon, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, React has spent 7 years in this space now at this point.
Yeah.
What have they learned? And how can we like take those learnings and apply them in the Rails context? So one thing that's like been really sticky about this is that a lot of the CSS and JS work was done, like architecturally, philosophically was done before CSS variables were.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to figure out is like, it's 2021. GitHub, at least internally from our engineering practices, we assume the existence of CSS variables. We use them for dark mode, for example, without CSS variables.
Yeah.
We assume that they are available as a technology for us to use. Given that fact, how much of the CSS and JavaScript learnings really still apply? We don't know. So we're trying to like reconcile like the current technologies with like the lessons from React and put them into something that works. We do actually run something like this in production today. It's very minimal, but we are actually doing some production experiments around this work.
Are you able to say what part of the app is experimenting with it?
It's some settings page that's buried. It's very trivial. It's like a technical proof of concept. There's nothing like, we're not even doing anything that you couldn't have done without it. It's just like, does the stack work?
Got it.
It treads into a lot of tricky waters, like around post CSS and Webpacker and like all these areas where we've kind of intentionally avoided on the ViewComponent project, but kind of feels like an inevitability. Like we're going to have to deal with it with assets, like they're a big part of building UI. And that's kind of an area of what I would call like more like research we're doing right now, which is like some pretty exciting stuff to be doing as a Rails engineer, you know. with a
Yeah.
framework that's been around this long.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating too as well because like my experience in Rails was coming at Rails 3.2 and
Oh
eventually
wow,
being on 4. So this is back 2012, 2013 is when I first got
yeah,
into
that's when I got
Rails.
started too.
Yeah, yeah. Which did you do a boot camp as well?
I did an apprenticeship at a software consultancy that's based in Rhode Island called Mojitech. It was right as boot camps were starting to be a thing.
Yeah.
That they would do a couple apprenticeships a year where you just came in and they paired you with a senior and you paired for like 3 months
Okay.
and they just
Yeah.
like taught you Rails. It was the best thing ever. Like,
Yeah. I
yeah,
there was one of those in my hometown too as well. A
mm-hmm.
flight.
Yep,
Which
eFlight, yep.
yeah, I applied for that, but I didn't get it. So I ended up just learning online through like, the Rails guides and a ton of other
Yeah,
places. But yeah, that's fascinating. But also, I was gonna say, yeah, it's got to be nice to be able to do something that's kind of cutting edge, like regardless if this like, well, it sounds like the CSS stuff is going back to the drawing board, but it's got to be fun to be able to like solve problems and like event solutions too as well.
yeah. I mean, that's I don't know. I'll be honest with you, man. Like, this is a dream job for me. Like,
Yeah,
the mix of what I have right now, where it's like roughly a third on the framework, a third on primer, and then a third just like helping people at the company use them both properly. Like, I'm a pretty happy guy getting to do all that.
yeah. No, I agree. I feel like I work on such smaller problems in the open source world because I just don't have any long-standing relationships and projects
Mhm.
currently. But I love just going around and like dropping issues and questions. Not so much of the long-standing like back and forths with code. But yeah, very cool. It. Who else is working on this with you at GitHub?
Uh, let's see. The people who are working on it with me currently, Christian Odson, Kate Higa, Blake Williams, and Manuel Puyol.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, pretty good, pretty solid team. They oh my goodness, it's just so much fun. Like, I took some time off this week to go see family post vaccine, and I just came back, this morning, looked at Slack, and they're cranking away, shipping code, writing issues. It's really, that's been, I think, the most fulfilling part of this project has been like realizing that to execute on a vision this big, I need to work with other people, and just seeing the fruits of that. That, like, I mean, at this point I write code, but like other people are well equipped to do that. So I focus a lot on equipping other people to make good contributions to the project, whether they're in the community or not. Like, I regularly, like, some people in the chat might even be on this list, that like if someone files a good issue on the project and it's something that like we all agree we need, and especially if it's something that would be useful for us internally, I'll be the first to go to email them and say, hey, let's just pair on it. I'll help you get started.
Yeah.
I'll help you write the right tests, and like we'll talk about architecture, whatnot, so you can submit a good PR.
Yeah.
And that's, I do that probably about once a month with someone completely new to the project from around the world. And that is like, that's some fun stuff, man. Like,
Yeah.
it's really, it reminds me of like how often I struggle to explain my job to non-technical people. They're like, you work on open source? Like, what even is open source? Wait, your work is free? Why did they pay you to do this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so much value too, as well as getting like who was it, the Bridgetown person?
Yeah,
I just saw
Jared's
their,
in there. Yeah.
yeah. He jumped in with, oh, there he goes. It's cool to see like his response here because he's working on a project unrelated to GitHub that is solving a whole other problem to then eventually give you enough fuel or ammo to basically say, okay, let's not even attempt the Jekyll thing right now because uh, Jared's having some issues. So like we should just help Jared, help him solve it, and then now you have this whole another stream of consciousness and at bats to be able to solve a problem that you don't have to focus on, and you could focus on the CSS stuff or something else. So it's nice to see that. I see the value in open source, but I know it's an uphill battle, and I know there's a whole conferences around this and trying to convince enterprises to get involved in open source in a way that it's beneficial to the community, beneficial to you, but also beneficial to some somebody who just wants to help solve a problem.
Yeah, and I think that that's like, isn't that the Goldilocks question for all this? Is like, how do you, like, I've never done open source before. This is my one open source project I've ever done. Like, how did we get here? Like, I kind of think that it's really just a factor of the Rails community. Like, there's so much convention in the Rails world. Like, we started this project and someone came in like out of the blue and was like, why don't we just do action mailer previews, but for components? And I'm like, duh. And like, he's now landed like dozens of PRs building this feature and maintaining the feature. Like, that's an entire part of the framework. I have never written a line of code in that whole part of the framework, but we use it internally. And he just knew, because of Rails conventions, that like this feature would make sense.
Yeah.
And this just happens over and over and over again. So like, I think that the alignment with the community has been our kind of way in. Like, if you've contributed to anything in Rails, you could come into this framework and feel right at home, because we name things the same way. We use the same documentation tool, the same test framework. Like, we're doing a lot of the same stuff. And I think it's shown there's a lot of people lining up to write code, which is pretty cool.
Cool. Well, with that, we're almost at time. We just had a XKCD comic get dropped in the chat, so I figure for the benefit of the people here with us, we'll share this. We should make this a thumbnail in the YouTube video, but amazing, yeah. And this is open source.
Yeah, and I think that like that's also been a big lesson on asking for help on this project, is that like I love taking vacations. Like I just took the last like 2.5 days off. I didn't bring any work stuff with me. And because we have a really strong community internally and externally, I feel comfortable stepping away for a couple of days or for a little while, because I know that I'm not the one little block there in the comic. Like, there's a whole series of blocks holding up the Jenga tower.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's a wonderful thing to hear too as well, because like there was a question. I spoke at PyCon yesterday, and there was a question that came up in the Q&A about burnout, because like I spoke in the lightning track round, so we all Q&A'd together, and there was one person that talked about mental health and how it applies to programming, and but burnout is real, even if it's your day job, because there's always going to be issues. There's always going to be something else to look for, like the next
even if it's something you love.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to. You can be burned out by things that are the highest form of satisfaction for you, and that's been a real lesson for me on this project. Is like starting to see signs of that at times, but asking for help. And luckily, I'm just so fortunate to work with people that like I can put my complete trust in. Like, I have several people on the group that I told you about that like, if I needed to step away for a month, I wouldn't even blink. I trust them completely. And that, that makes open source sustainable for me, because it is a lot of work to run this project and, give talks and whatnot, that it's good to have a team behind you and not be doing it alone.